certain extent to marginally to South Africa. And within that, I think I might have mentioned that, how in fact Gandhi is regarded as Girmit. In fact, he wasn't, but, in more of a hagiographic work, you will find that the idea of Girmit is also used for Gandhi. In fact, that reminds me of a very popular, hagiographical work written by Girmit on Gandhi. It's called Pehla Girmitiya. Gandhi as the first Girmit. Anyway, now coming back to other, the idea of theoretical understanding of Girmitiya. You also know that. Hello.
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Yeah, fine. So the another point that I told you about the theoretical, understanding is the idea of Girmit as a category, and as Sudesh Mishra puts that Girmit is re-memory. You remember the RE is within bracket, and then you have memory. So this again that Girmit is always about re-memory. So you find that the memory becomes a very much important, or in other words, indispensable part of Girmit identity. And here, again, let me emphasize on the idea of memory, and that will again, perhaps persuade us to rethink the idea of memory, specifically as far as intergenerational trauma is concerned. That brings us to the concept of post-memory that I explained in the last class. Post-memory or belated memory by Marin Harris, where she is specifically looking at this idea of belated memory or post-memory as a mean of understanding the experience of children of Holocaust survivor. So when you look at Marin Harris, she hasn't written on Girmitiya, but her idea of post memory, it was first, she studied the memories of the generation of Holocaust survivor. Okay, but the framework that provided, you find that it is used for various others reading. In last class, I also gave example of partition studies, how intergenerational trauma is analyzed in partition study using post memory. Similarly, even in Girmitiya also, you find that you can adopt this approach of post memory in studying their idea of belated memories, because specifically if you look at these narratives that we are discussing, Brijlal or Aniruddha or Gitanjali, you find that they are not the one who have experienced this. Now, when you talk about memory, experience and memory are related. So, what happens to the memories of people, memories which are passed down from generation to generation? And one who is narrating, he has not experienced the things directly, but yet you experience it indirectly through various narratives. So this, frame of this framework for understanding these intergenerational trauma or intergenerational memory is called post-memory. But I must also tell you, Marin Harris is one of the early, but later you also have, other critic. For example, you have someone like Jeffrey Hartman, who also talks about trauma, memory, and intergenerational. But again, as I mentioned, that one framework would be enough, and let us just stick to Marin Harris' idea of post memory. So in this case, when you look up at the descendant, when you look at the idea of intergenerational trauma, as I mentioned, there is no direct experiencing of the event or experiencing of the trauma, but it is through someone's narrative. So you can see it is not, so you can't recollect something. So when you are, if someone asks about, memory of your grandfather, so I mean, not your memory, but, something that your grandfather has told. So you can just recollect that particular narrative, but you can't recollect the original experience. So in this case, the memory works through a very different way. It is through imaginative investment and creation. So the narrator, in this case, the descendant, they are investing into these narratives using their imagination and using their creative fire. So this is what, how post-memory works, that it is not direct recollection, but the memory works through imaginative investment and recreation. Now I'll just give you one example, and this things becomes more, it will be more clear. Now if you have read Aniruddha's narrative, passage from India, which is part of the text, which we shall discuss, you will find that he is perhaps trying to recreate a story, or rather it is also an imaginative story. It is not a narrative that he has heard, rather he's also imagining. So you can see that it is not always that, someone is, narrating the story, but you also, how you are recollecting, it depends upon your imaginative investment and creation. Is that fine? Now, Marian Hirsch, when she, described post-memory, she talks about post-memory as the experience of people who grow up dominating by narrative that preceded their birth. Okay, so something that happened before your birth. But even then, because these narratives, these memories have been passed from generation to generation, your personality is dominated by it. You might not have witnessed, but your personality is dominated. And this is what she found out while working on the memory of children of Holocaust survivor. The children of Holocaust survivor, they have not witnessed Holocaust, but even then, their whole personality was dominated by the memory of their father or, earlier generation. Is that fine? So in case of diasporas, generally speaking diasporas, not just, Girvitias or even exile, you can see that, the exile is from one place of identity. Now, this movement, this migration is always a very characteristic aspect of post-memory. Okay. And when you ask the descendant or the children to think about it, you can see it works in a, as I mentioned, imaginative investment and creation, but then there is this witnessing, which is not direct. And Marian Hirsch used this idea of retrospective witness by adoption. Retrospective witness by adoption, because you are not witnessing, you are looking back at something, so this becomes a retrospective witness, and you are not directly looking at it, but rather you are adopting someone's experience. Now, this idea of someone that I'm talking about, it might be the generation, your father, your ancestor. It might be the society that you come from. Your family might not have experience, but the society. Or in other case, you might have some of your friend who might have, experienced this. So, you can see there are various ways in which, we can understand how, post-memory works. Is that fine? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Any question?
Yes,
Shall we stop here? Yes. Any question, anything that you want to ask or you want me to repeat? This is an important perspective, approach of, understanding the descendant, so the memory of the descendant. Okay, so let me just, revise it. I mentioned this idea of post-memory, in which we talk about intergenerational trauma or intergenerational transfer of memory. So you have couple of words: post-memory, intergenerational transfer of memory, or even belated memory. How trauma or memory, they are passed down in stories and accounts, in narratives, in which you find that memory is handed by family members or even by the wider committee. This is what I told you. But remember, there is two things. I think in last class I did mention the idea of risk involved in this transfer. If you remember that, how your personality is dominated by something that you have not witnessed, which means that your own experiences, is erased, and then you are dominated by someone else's experience. So the risk I have already mentioned. But remember, it is also how something is narrated. So what is narrated, the content part is important. But remember, there is another important aspect when you look at how the memories are passed from one generation to another. How it is narrated. What is narrated is important, but how it is narrated is equally important, or it is sometimes more important. Okay, the ways in which it is told. Now, remember, the ways in which it is told, it can even operate as a fairy tale. It can operate as a nightmare. It can even become a myth. It can be internalized by children when they are too young. Remember, at this tender age, children, they might not be able to fully understand it, but even then, these memories become part of them. And, you find that even when they are growing up, they are dominated by these memories, how their father migrated. And this is something that is happening in various, narratives in this collection. Is that fine? Now, with this, taking cue from all these things, let us see how some of the narratives or some of the, descendant of Girmitias, they talk about the memory of their ancestor. And one very interesting example in the text is Brijlal's the tamarind tree. Brijlal's the tamarind tree. Is that fine? In this, you will find, hello, I think, I would also like to, let me see if I can share my slide. Just give me a minute. Yeah. Can you see the slide?
Yes, sir.
Can you see this? Great. Fine. So with this, let us begin by talking about, the tamarind tree. Why tamarind tree? The name could be, by Brijlal. And remember, we have been talking about Brijlal's, perspective on Girmitiyas. Now, this is a very important narrative. The title itself is very interesting. It's tamarind tree. Tamarind tree, remember, this narrative is set in Fiji. And tamarind, as you know, is not something that is usually found in Fiji. So this tree again, and in fact in Brijlal's narrative also, you find that the tree also has migrated. Now, this tree is very important, so here you find that, Brijlal is not just talking about, obviously he's talking about his his family, but here you can see the personal narrative, as I've been telling you, that, the autobiographies are not just about self. The self become, representative of society. So in this narrative, you find how Brijlal is, bringing two things together. He's looking at personal, but along with the personal, he's also looking at social, cultural, of Girmitiyas in the new hostland. So he's talking about a tree that is near his house, So you can see that, in this narrative, he talks about how a tree becomes important or indispensable part of social and cultural life of migrant in the new host land. Remember, this narrative is narrated by a descendant, Brijlal, and he's talking about his ancestor. And remember, even his father, Brijlal, when he was born, he was free. The system was abolished. In fact, when his father was young, the system was abolished. Now he's thinking about his grandfather. But, you find that this tree was playing an important role in the life of, his grandfather, his father, and in fact, he also talked about how, this place was important for him. But, as I mentioned, it is not just about personal, it is about social. So you can see it is a very important part, both as a space and both as a place. Remember, the aspect more of an abstract idea, as in fact as a physical place also, it plays a very important role in both social and cultural. And if you also think even in psychological, so at various level you find that, this tree is playing a very important role in the text. Interestingly, the very first thing, you notice that this tree, as the narrator calls it, it says that it is a silent witness. Now, here, when we talk about memory, or when you talk about testimony, basically, let's not talk about memory, because let's talk about testimony. Now, there is something which is very interesting about testimony. Who can testify? Who has, the right to give testimony? Obviously, for a layman, I'm not going into philosophical dimension, where, we shall be talking about it a bit later, because, the witnessing and post-colonial becomes a very important question. But here, if you look at a general idea of witnessing, you need to experience something when you witness, when you are testifying something. So similarly, in this tree, there is someone who has witnessed something. So this tamarind tree has witnessed everything. You remember, tamarind tree as these, the community of Girmiti, I believe that it has also, come along with someone. Someone has brought it from India. But yet it remained with them. So it is a silent witness. Remember, this tree is a witness, but the tree obviously is silent. It can't say anything. Remember, it is a personal narrative. It's not a fictional narrative. In various fictional narrative, you might have, these kinds of witnesses. Think about, a very interesting novel where the speaker or the narrator is not a human being, but a tree. I'm talking about, the Hindi novel Neem Ka Ped by Rahi Masoom Raza. So you have this Neem Ka Ped that is narrating, and interestingly, why I'm giving this example, because there you see how Neem Ka tree becomes, a witness of the generation of, the trauma that is part of a specific family of bonded laborers, okay, in UP. Similarly, you can think about other examples also. I was thinking of this more recent television series, Gullak, where there is this Gullak which is narrating the story of a middle class family. But interestingly, because this is a personal narrative, this is not a fictional narrative, you find that this tree is there as a narrative, but yet it is a silent witness. Interestingly, there is someone who has the agency to speak, but he has adopted it. So you can also see there is something, a kind of very interesting use of this idea of witnessing in the narrative. There is someone who has witnessed everything, but this tree cannot speak. Okay, so there is someone else who is speaking on the behalf of the tree, who has not witnessed, but he has, this whole idea of retrospective witness. Okay. As you can see, the author or the narrator is a descendant of migrant from India, and in this specific, narrative, he is remembering the tree. He's thinking about his family, and then you can also see how he's thinking about community. And see, everything is related. It's almost like a link. He thinks about himself, then it's his father, his grandfather, then through them you find that he's talking about his community, and then through that he's talking about a larger community. So you can see that, this tree is something that persuades him to think about, his whole community, which begins from self and then moves towards the society. So it's not just about personal relationship with the tree, or it is not just about, recollection of familial relationship, rather it is about, the specific, system of migration. And if you remember, last time I also told you how, there are, scholars who talk about how specifically Vijay Mishra, that, Kala Pani becomes a symbol of Girmiti, a whole complete endangered system. So similarly here also, you can see how a small, tree, it's not a small tree, but how tree becomes a symbol of the life of Girmitia in a new island, and which is very interesting because you find Tamrind tree, as they believe, it was part of India. It was uprooted from India, then it was planted in Fiji. Okay. Similarly, these lives were uprooted from India and then they were planted in a new environment. So you can see it's almost like a parallel history, a narrative of a tree, but the tree cannot speak, but yet there is this person who is narrating that story. So there is almost like a parallel between the tree, uprooting of tree from India and taking it to Fiji. And similarly, you also have, this idea where they are talking about, migrating from one place to another. Is that fine? Okay. In a text, you find that, and these are terms that, Brijlal uses. He talks about the tree as terra serica for father, which means that it is a sacred place. So for his father, this was not just simple a tree, it was a sacred place. And then he says that, it is a place of special memory linking him with another time and past. Okay, and a lot of place in the narrative, if you have read the narrative, you can find that the narrator is emphasizing this fact that, there is this connection between past and present, and the tree is a space where past and present, they come together. Is it fine? Past and present, they mix together, they blend together. But I think, when you read in between the line, I suppose, he did not, write, but you can also see that this is a space where past, present, and future, everything mix. It's not just a place where, past and present mix, as it is, written in the narrative. It is a special place of memory linking his father to this past. So it's not just father, it is a narrator also. It is every Girmitia connects with this tree. And I also said it is also a place where they think about future. So past, obviously, they're thinking about their family, their roots, everything. the present, the way specifically the way they are reclaiming their identity. And finally, it is a place we will also find which they are also thinking about their future, specifically for the, laborers who have completed their 5-year contract. So this is also a place where past, present, as well as I would say, future mix. So this is a very special place, not just for his father, but for everyone. Okay. And he also says that he remembers his father crying, and he says that memory remained with me. But remember, this is just one memory that remained with him. But later on, we find there are so many memory that is part of his identity. Okay. Then he says that this tamarind tree specifically was an adda or a gathering place for Girmitia during his father days. Not now, but then during Girmitia days, it was a gathering place. Okay. This idea of gathering place becomes very important. Remember, I did mention the idea of community formation. If you remember, specifically when they are traveling to these new colonies, you remember the idea of Jahazi Bhai Behan that we had a discussion on. But remember, we might talk about the community formation on ships, but I must also tell you, that it's not that everyone who traveled by same ship were allocated. They lived in one colony. They were distributed. And then single men were. So it's not that the Jahazi relationship that they developed on the ship. It was not a long. It might be long lasting, but it was not that it continued. There might be various factors. So this place, in New Hosteland, when different people, those who perhaps we cannot think about their Jahazi relationship, they try to form a community. So this narrative is also about community formation in New Hosteland. Okay. Earlier I mentioned community formation on ships, which almost everyone talks about Jahazi Bhai Behan or the ship brotherhood or sisterhood, as you would like to call. But here you find that when they have migrated, and in fact there are very interesting examples in the text where you find how community formation is taking place in New Hosteland. Okay, and there are various reasons why the system that they brought from India. As I mentioned that it is not just migration of individual. With this, there are so many things that are migrating, language and everything. So you can find that how things are changing in the New Hosteland. Okay, so this idea of community formation becomes very important, and this adda is part of a community formation. Is that fine? Okay. Now he says that for his father, the tree took him back to his own childhood in the immediate post-endangered days of 1920s. Remember, 1920s in Fiji, the system ended, and his father was remembering the time then. So with this tree, he's so attached to the tree because it reminded him of how the system was abolished. For his father, for his grandfather, it might be different. So you can see that every generation has their own reason to like the tree. They have their special, it becomes special for place of memory for each generation, but they have their own reason for this. Okay, and as I mentioned that he says that this tree is a mulki tree, and this is a term that he uses. And if you remember, he says that it's a silent witness. It's a place of special memory. It was a adda, and then he says that it is a mulki tree, or something that was brought from homeland. And remember, as I mentioned in the last class, the idea of mulk and the idea of watan, it is not same as we think about. For example, even now when you go to various villages, they often ask you, "Aapka watan kahan hai?" Which means that they are asking for your city or maybe for your for your village. They don't mean, they all know that you are from India, but even then they ask you, "Aapka watan kahan hai?" So watan is basically synonymously used for the idea of home then, or the idea of mulk. Now they say mulki tree, it means someone has brought it from homeland. Okay, and then he says that it is believed that someone bought it sometime in 1890s, which is very interesting because people are carrying a few things. They are carrying statues, they are carrying religion. I'm talking about very religious scriptures. But it's very interesting. Why would somebody take a tree along with them? So this idea of tree becomes very important. And I don't know if you know this. You might also find in various narratives how people are carrying some soil with them. In a small packet, they carry the soil of their homeland. I remember in one of the narratives there was this reference of someone who has migrated to Lahore, and then there is someone who is visiting obviously after 1947 partition, someone visited this particular person, and then he specifically asked for salt of Delhi, that I wanted to eat salt of Delhi. So you find that the way this tree becomes a very important symbol, because it is a mulki tree first, but here I think the tree here is very important, because if you look at the idea of roots, and ROOT, root, and oblique ROUTS. So the tree then is symbol of both its own roots reaching to India and the way it has traveled from India to Fiji. So this becomes a very good example of how we have been discussing the idea of roots and roots. Secondly, although he is not saying in who brought it, till someone early Girmitia brought it. It's very interesting why someone would carry an imli tree or a tamarind tree. And interestingly, you find a lot of food. If you look at this creolization of food, and in fact in this narrative also you find he talks about creolization of food. This slavery played a very significant role in this creolization of food. When you remember, I also I was just reading. I don't know whether it's a legend or it's a kind of authentic history. But this is how okra, or how some of you might call it ladyfinger or bhindi, it reached to America. It was through slaves. When they were traveling, they used to bring these seeds. They used to tie it in their hair, and then this is how it reached to America. I mean, again, I haven't read it, and it might not be authentic, so it might be just more like an urban or popular legend. Anyway, but you can see that this is how food is being created. And interestingly, you find that there are people who were who were also migrating from some of other parts of India where imli or tamarind is a very important part of food. So that might be one of the reasons why they have taken an imli tree there. So he's just speculating. Remember, I think I might have given you this example that I was also I was on a teaching assignment, and then I met someone who was again from India. So this person had some very interesting spices from his state. And it was a very unique spice. So I just asked, can't you get these kinds of spices here? So he said, that's not spice, this is an emotion. So the food is not an item to be consumed, it is an emotion. So he said that the smell of this spice connects me to my mother, to my family, and that is why I brought it. So this might be one of the reasons why someone brought mulki tree or a tamarind tree to Fiji. Okay. And in fact, for the narrator, it is important because he says that this is a touchstone for me. This is a touchstone. It is an indispensable site of communication. And, this site is for living as well as dead. And that is why, again, you can see he's bringing the idea of both, past and present, the living and dead alike. So he says that this is a touchstone. This is a site of communion, where you find different elements mixing together. Now, this idea of past and present, where he's talking about living and dead. Remember, he says that how it connected people to the past, and it is a reminder of their ancestral root as well as roots. So you can see both an entry and exit point. So someone is entering into the system. You find that the tree provides him with an entry, and then perhaps this entry is also an entry into a new life as a Girmitia. So the tree is there, and when the system is over, after 5 years, you can see the tree is there. So both at exit and entry point, you can see it reminded people of their roots and roots. Is that fine? Okay. Then he says that amidst all the chaos of new life, and remember when I say new life, remember this new life again is quite difficult. As some of the scholars have said that, a lot of people were, beaten, they were punished. So amidst all the chaos, you find that this tree provided a site of rest and respite. But yet it was a social place. It was also a personal place. And there is a very interesting description how, often people used to come and sit together, not as a community, just to, relax. So this was a place of sight and respite amidst the chaos of new life in the host land. Okay. And for him, he says that, for him as well as for every Girmitia, this became a symbolic, source of renewal, reassurance, rejuvenation. That they were tired and they used to come and rest there. Interestingly, this is how they connected with their roots. Specifically, there is this reference of particular dress. The way the people dress in their traditional dress and came to buy and sell things. And if you have read the narrative, you find that he also says that, this becomes an excuse. The weekly market, they became an excuse to meet and greet everyone. Now, this idea of, wearing traditional dress, specifically on a weekly market, is also a celebration of their identity. And it is also through with this, specifically dressing up, they are reconnecting to their, roots. Remember, these Girmit laborers, they are from different parts of India, but in various other narratives, you will find that, before they boarded the ship, before they embarked on their journey, they were asked to, to remove everything that was, symbolic of their, symbolic of their identity. For example, the high caste men were asked to remove all the markers of their identity. Similarly, Mahadai, in her poem, she talks about how, they were given a simple robe. Everyone was given one kind of robe. But later, you find that, through these weekly markets, they are specifically wearing their dresses. They are, dressing in a traditional dress to reclaim their identity. So to come and buy, this becomes an opportunity for them to celebrate their identity. Okay. This particular point is about basically future. When the term is over, it provided them a place to contemplate their future, where they discuss the difficulty and uncertainty of laborers after the term was over. Remember, these two things here. Two things are important after the term is over. One is obviously to stay there and continue your life. Now, staying there, there are various ways. One is obviously signing a new contract, okay, and then, becoming a laborer with someone else. Now, after this system was abolished, some of them returned to India and most of them decided to stay. Now, obviously, those who were perhaps trying to even think about return, this was a place which, provided them, enough opportunity to think about their future. Now, thinking about future was a very difficult thing to do because, when you are returning to your native place, you can't return as you were, because the idea of crossing Kalapani, as I've already discussed the self gets polluted. Now, when you are coming back to your own system, it becomes difficult for you to adjust in your own system because you have polluted your own self. Secondly, you have been part of a system in which everything was not as rigid as it was in your native place. So everyone who stayed in New Hosteland, returning or the question of return was very difficult. Okay, so he's perhaps in fact thinking about this tree as a space where people used to come and in fact discuss these kinds of possibilities. They used to talk about the difficulties and uncertainty of their life, specifically after the term was over. Okay. Um, as I mentioned that, these narratives, or specifically Brijlal's narrative, is also about community formation. And there are various ways in which, he's talking about community formation. You remember one I have already mentioned, how the tree becomes an adda. Second, you think about the weekly market. But there is one very interesting, way in which the community was formed. It is through the idea of collective servitude. The idea of collective servitude. Is that fine? Hello? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Any question? Shall we stop here? You want me to repeat anything? No. Fine. So the idea of collective servitude. Now the idea of collective servitude is important. This is a way in which the community was formed. So one was obviously Jahazi relationship, but I have already mentioned down they are part of a new Osnan, where Jahazi relationship may or may not continue. But yet there was this idea of collective servitude. No matter if you're high caste or low caste, you're fair or dark, whether you hail from north or south, the southern part of India, you are all living, together with others in these confined spaces of Kuli line. And in fact, not in this narrative, there is this very interesting essay that Brijlal has written, and I will, after this class, I will talk about that, not after, let me finish this. You will see that, he's basically describing these Kuli lines and these confined spaces in which, everyone was together. So high caste, low caste, women, how they were, living in that confined space. I don't mean to say that, men and women, different men, strange men and women living together. No, not that. I'm talking about even the whole Kuli line. If you look at the idea of Kuli line, it was a confined space. So this was an example of collective servitude. Even if you're from high class or lower class, if you're from high caste or low caste, you're men or women, you're all are collectively, you are working as a collect, and everyone is known as Kuli, everyone is Girmiti and Fiji. It is not that, it's not the privilege that you are born, you're from high caste, so you'll get more benefit. No. So Brijlal says that, this idea of collective servitude becomes a very important way in which, the communities were formed. And one way of how community was formed was through living together in these, confined spaces. Okay, so this is very interesting. Like, this confined spaces, it brings a kind of, companionship among themselves. Remember, people in one colony, they might be from different state, speaking different kind of language, cooking different food. But yet, although I don't mean to say that the family was intact, especially most of the time. But yet, you can see that they were also trying to, communicate with other people. And this is how communities were formed. Now, I must also tell you that, when you read Tamrind tree, you find that, Brijlal is more, concerned with Tamrind tree as, as a space of community, and the more focus is on the public. It's not basically on the private, but specifically how the community was formed, and the emphasis is on the public life of the community. In fact, there is another text in which we will find the emphasis is on the private, but yet see how he's basically talking about public. And when you talk about the public life, obviously, gender becomes important. And here you find that Brijlal is specifically talking about men. Okay, men who gathered under Tamrind tree, they maintained a semblance at the time of chaos and confusion. Okay, so he says that it was not this community formation. The men were also responsible for keeping the community intact. Once a community is formed, you also need to keep intact. And men who met at Tamrind tree, they kept the community intact. Is that fine? Then, okay, in this narrative, when you look at community formation, when you look at how they're remembering, as I mentioned, I've already given you one example of mulki tree and food, but in this text, you find that he also talks about creolization of food. And in fact, it would be a cliche to repeat, but I think some of you might not be aware how food becomes a very important marker of identity, and specifically when you look at diaspora, how they talk about food, and it is not just something through which they connect with identity. Food is a very complex symbol of identity. When you look at diaspora narrative, one very simple example I think most of you are familiar with is Jhumpa Lahiri's namesake. It starts with this. I forgot the name. What is the name of the protagonist who is making jhalmuri? Anyway, that's fine. We don't need to know the name. Yeah.
Ashima.
Hello.
Ashima, sir.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, Ashima. You remember the way Ashima is trying to, make jhalmuri out of rice crisp. So this idea of, Ashima making, rice crisp to connect with her, her home. Similarly, here also you find that Brijlal is also talking about food. And food, as I mentioned, that it's a very complex. It's not just simple way of connecting. Through this, he's also talking about realization of food. That is an important way. But how even when you try to recreate food, it is not as good as it was in your hometown. And this is what he also tells in the narrative, that here he knows that the food as it is available here, it is not as good as it is in your homeland. And to give this example, you can see how food and memory are interlinked with each other. Partition fiction, you have a lot of example. In fact, this very popular text, Sea Lies Ahead. Sea lies ahead by Intizar Hussain, Aage Samandar Hai, where you find that they are also so it's about some of those people who migrated from Meerut. Now you find that even after migrating, they are thinking about this specific, delicacy that is called revdi. And they have different kinds of revdi that is mentioned, Delhi wali revdi, Meerut wali revdi. So you can also see how, the identity of people who have migrated is differentiated on the basis of specific item like revdi. So food, as I mentioned, is a very complex, metaphor of identity. Similarly, I'm also thinking of, specifically, this is related to our narrative. In this text called Sleepwalker by Joginder Paul, again, it's very interesting how, he's talking about migration. So, and I might have mentioned this narrative. It is about, people who migrated from Lucknow to Karachi. So, when they have migrated to Karachi, they have recreated a section of Karachi, they have turned a section of Karachi into Lucknow. And it even appears to everyone who migrated that they are still in Lucknow. Okay, so in fact, there is this metaphor of Lucknow in Karachi in Sleepwalker, which is a translation of Kobru. Now, interestingly, when they are when they are in this specific place of Lucknow, and now this Lucknow is not the India of Lucknow, Lucknow that they have created in Karachi, you find that they specifically, wearing their cap in a very different way. Wearing tirchi topi, not, in a way how, a topi is worn. Secondly, there is this character called Diwani Molvi Sahab. Okay, he's a madman, and he has gone mad because he has migrated. And he still thinks that he's in Lucknow. So in that character, there is a scene where they are talking about Malihabadi Aam. Now, Malihabad is a small place near Lucknow, and the mangoes of Malihabad, they are, really delicious. They are quite big. So they talk that now after migrating to Karachi, they are discussing, how, the discussion starts with a clay mango. So someone gives a clay mango, a mango made of clay. And this clay mango is quite, similar to Malihabadi mangoes. So someone, gives this clay mango to Diwani Maulvi Sahab and tells that, this is a replica of Malihabadi mango. And so Diwani Maulvi Sahab replies, says that, the replica is even better than the original mangoes that are available in Karachi. So even if it is a replica which is made out of clay, it is better than the original mangoes that are grown in Karachi. So you can also see that even when you try to recreate the food, you can't. There is this failed attempt, and the idea of field is very interesting because this is what I mentioned in my introductory class. This migration against was a failed millennial quest, if you remember how Vijay Mishra puts it. Anyway, now returning back to the idea of food, and this is what, you have this example, how father remembered from those distant conversation was clear that among the Girmitia, that the fruits back home in India were always sweeter, the best. So you can't have the exact food in your host land. Then, as I mentioned, the creolization of food apart from language, he talks about appropriation of food, specifically talking about assimilation of the specific food item. He says that was first Fijian item that Indian truly appropriated. So this appropriation of not language, appropriation of lifestyle, but also appropriation of food, and that is why you have a lot of reference to food. And in fact, I think I might have mentioned that recently I attended a lecture by someone whose ancestors migrated from somewhere, from Pondicherry. So this guy was speaking, and I shouldn't call him guy; it's a scholar. The scholar was speaking on creolization of food, and then he mentioned this very interesting food which is available in India. Obviously, it's not an indigenous dish, but it's quite popular. Halim. Now he says that a variety of halim is also available in France, and this variety reached to France, before we talk about globalization and interconnectivity and transnationality. But remember this, how this migration was also very important when you look at creolization or appropriation of food. And in fact, this is how Brijlal talks about creolization of food. But even then, creolization, hybridity, that is important. But he also says that Girmitia, no matter what, they will always occupy a space of liminality, which is in betweenness, and this is how he talks about the idea of in betweenness. And this might also remind you of someone else who talks about in betweenness. Yes, Homi Bhabha, the idea of in betweenness. Okay, anyway, is that fine? Now let's move to the significance of tamarind tree. Remember, we did mention the idea of Adda, but Adda becomes important because this was a place where people recreated the ritual. Interesting use of verb here. A very interesting use of verb. If you see the slide, I have highlighted it red. People recreated the ritual. It is not celebrated, it's recreated, remember? So the way they are recreating these rituals. And interestingly, if you try to understand this idea of recreation, this is also an attempt in community formation. So that brings me to the next point, how perhaps you can think about religion as a factor that was important for them. Okay? Although I'm not trying to say that religion was the most dominating. In fact, this is one mistake that we often, do, that we think, maybe for some of us, religion is the most important factor of our identity, but, it is not most of the time the most important aspect of one's religious identity. Although I'm not trying to say that these people did not believe in religion, but, how the way they recreated certain religious and cultural ritual is important, And in fact, Brijlal, in another narrative, which is more like a companion piece, and I want you to read that text. And I think in this text, more than this text, you will find all lines of Girmitia life. In another essay, which was published in a book edited by Brijlal. And the name of this book is Bittersweet. Bittersweet. It's a collection of essays by, obviously, the descendant of, and some of the scholars of Indian labor, edited by Brijlal. It's called Bittersweet. Now, in this text, there is this essay by Brijlal. It's called Girmitia Memory History. Girmitia Memory History. Now, in this specific text, you will find that, Brijlal talks about community formation. He talks about history. I mean, you will have a lot of, whatever point I've told you about community forms and clothesline, you will get these points in detail in this specific essay. Very interesting essay. Now, one very interesting description in that essay is about religion. How religion was a very important factor in their life, and how they looked at as religion as a source of inspiration. And so let me come back to this idea of recreation. Now remember, these rituals, they range from local rituals to more like common, like, performances. So the performatic aspect also. For example, you have a lot of reference to how Ram Leela was performed. Okay, in various. Now remember, Ram Leela as a part of culture. Okay, it is not, it might be important as a part of culture, but yet, think about this framework, the story, the narrative. It is also about exile. Remember, the idea of Vanvas becomes important here. So the idea of exile, then the hero of Ramayana, Rama, the Lord Rama, how he becomes a symbol of enduring all the hardships of Vanvas. Then, remember, it was also, Ramayana is a story of a family. Even in exile, the family went together. So family as a unit. So you can see how, and this is what, Brijlal talks about in the other essay that I mentioned, how the narrative framework of Ramayana was used by various, migrants to they were trying to model them. So they used to, derive some consortium from these narratives. Also thinking about the ideal men and ideal women. Anyway, so that these points you will, get in the another essay. But then there is another interesting point here. The way they are recreating the ritual. The idea of recreating the ritual. So you might again think about rituals as site of memories. Rituals as site of memories. Rituals as site of memory. There are other references also. Muharram, for Muslim diasporas, Muslim migrant, Muharram was a very important. In fact, V.S. Naipaul has a very interesting, narrative of Muharram. Obviously, that's very difficult, and how Naipaul was often criticized for that. But then there is this reference, the point that I'm trying to make among the believers. He talks about how Muharram was celebrated in Trinidad. So there is this reference to Ram Leela, Muharram, and some more local festival like Phagwa or Holi. I think I might have also given you a very example of Matikor or Matichor, a very local festival celebrated, not festival, a ritual, observed by women specifically from Bihar and, some of the part of UP. So these are still, celebrated. And interestingly, there is a collection of women poetry called Matkor or Matichor. And this again is a collection of English poems. Okay. Although they were trying to recreate this, but there is this impossibility of recreation. You can recreate, but then there will be, the success will be, it will not be a successful attempt to recreate. Remember, in the new land, the caste rules were loosening, even the religion rule was also loosening, and it was not possible. Like in their native place, inter-caste marriage would be a taboo. But you find that there are various examples. This was maybe for survival. They're also marrying, across, religion, across, the higher caste were getting married to women of lower caste. And similarly, so these were more of, strategy of survival. So the caste rules were losing, and in fact, Brijlal also says that it's very interesting that caste rules were loosening because one, obviously, it was individual. It was not, the social system was not same as it was in India. Even higher caste men were getting the same salary as a man from a lower caste. So secondly, he also says that even if you wanted to have caste system in a new host land, one needs to have resources in order to sustain caste system. But these men were without any resources. So even if they wanted, they would not have been positioned to have these caste system. Is that fine? Now if you look at this idea of tree as memory, you might think about this tree as a commemorative. I mean, specifically in thinking about the commemorative significance of the tree as a site of memory, and that again brings us to the idea of memory places, or uh, or as Perinora talks about, a site of memory. And I think I mentioned it while teaching the House and Sunlight on a book and column, how in that case house was a site of memory. Similarly, in this case, in this specific narrative, you can understand this space of Tamrind tree as a site of memory, is specifically how Perinora talks about the site of memory. He talks about site of memory, talking about material, symbolic, and functional site of memory. So it can be concrete, it can be abstract, okay, and it can have a symbolic. It can become a material site of memory. In this case, it is more of a material site of memory. And remember, I have also told you about the materiality and memory, specifically when you look at physical, objects, for example, the photographs. And in fact, in the other narrative that we're going to discuss, it will be more the material memory. And here also you can say it's more of material memory. But remember, it is not just material, it often becomes symbolic as well as functional. So this is how Perinera was talking about a space or a place as site of memory. Okay, it's basically a place where past is remembered. And right from the beginning, the way Brijlal narrates this place, you can see it's a physical place where past is remembered and constructed in the present day. Okay, so this tamarind tree as a site of memory. Okay. Secondly, you also think about, I mean, I mentioned materiality, but remember, site of memory is also non-material. So in this regard, you can think about all the rituals that they are celebrated, that becomes a non-material site of memory. The celebration of Muharram, that becomes non-material site of memory. But remember, when we talk about non-material site of memory, I don't mean to say that the dress that they're wearing in the Ramlila, that's non-material site of memory. No, the dress might be a physical, but the whole idea of recreating that ritual is non-material site of memory. This is what I mean to say. Okay, and when you look at site of memory, how important it is for a community. So when you look at site of memory, they almost become like touchstone. Touchstone is something through which you can measure. So they become a touchstone for the community. And in fact, more recent, if you look at the historian, the site of memory also, and this is what Brijlal is also trying to narrate a history of a community through this site of memory. So you can see that it becomes important when you look at the site of memory, because this again you can theorize how place as well as memory, they are interconnected with each other, or how can you think about a relationship, how you can think about relationship between memory and place. Okay, is that fine? Hello.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let us stop here. If you have any question, or if you